Right. Good morning, Europe. Good afternoon, Japan. Again, it's the second day of our online excursion. Welcome you all. Last time, Roland Hagenberg told us about traditional architecture and culture. And we took a tour through Kyoto. And today, Roland Hagenberg will tell us a little bit more about living and building, but in the city of Tokyo. He has also 4 special guests with him that he will introduce to you in a minute. And for those of you that are new with us or haven't been here with us last time, I would like to introduce Roland for a minute. Roland Hagenberg is a well-known author, photographer, and artist, and he grew up in Vienna. He now lives in Japan. In the 1980s, he lived in Berlin and New York, where he documented the lives of artists such as Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat. He currently lives in Tokyo, and his books on Japanese modern architects have been published in English, Chinese, and Japanese. Roland Hagenberg is also known for his writing project in Riding in Austria. Riding is the birthplace of the composer Franz Liszt, and he created an experimental guest house village with Japanese architects. In addition, Roland Hagenberg is a contributor to a lot of new magazines such as Vogue and Architectural Digest. So, Roland Hagenberg, I will give you the micro, and I'm looking forward to our excursion to Tokyo today. Thank you for joining us, you and your friends.
Well, thank you very much, Sandra, for the introduction and the invitation. Just last sound check, you can hear me all clearly. All okay?
Yes.
Okay. And thanks for joining, this time from Tokyo. With me is Michael Keferl. I will maybe come here. He's supporting us technically. He was with us last time already when we broadcasted from Kyoto. It's quite a different situation we have right now. For those of you who haven't joined last time, I will recap briefly the situation and the difference between Kyoto and now in Tokyo. We don't have outside setting with a fantastic background to show you the skyline or something. That's a little bit difficult. Last time we could give you a little bit of the flair of Kyoto inside the old building. So what we try, and that's again a little bit of a technical challenge, is afterwards take a little stroll through the Tokyo street, which is called Omote Sando. It's in a very fashionable area in Shibuya, and the so-called, people call it the Champs-Élysées of Tokyo. So we will try to capture some of the night scenes outside in the street. What we also try this time, we have invited 4 guests from all walks of life, so not only architects. We will start in about 20 minutes with a short interview via Skype with Charles Glover. He's a very well-known actor. He's an American, but a very well-known actor here in Tokyo in Japan, working also for the national broadcaster NHK. We will talk with him a little bit about his life experience and living in Tokyo. We have a architecture critic, Julian Worrall, who lived many years in Tokyo and is now professor in Australia, in Tasmania. He will join us also by Zoom later. So we scheduled that in 30 minutes sequences, and afterwards, if you have questions, you can ask questions directly to them too. And Sandra then will switch the screen. That is then up to you, Sandra. We have then also a brief talk. I thought that might be interesting, experience living in Tokyo with Maiko Gundermann. She's a translator. She grew up in Berlin. She is, her mother is Japanese, her father German. She lived in Hong Kong and moved with the family to Tokyo now. So I think that's also very interesting aspect of, to get her input on the perspectives that she has, what it means to live in Tokyo. But in the overall, what I want to bring from the feeling to you is what does it mean to, how does Tokyo eventually change you? How does it affect your feeling? How does it affect your work? And then in the end also, how does Tokyo, that particular architecture, also affect your life and your way how you're thinking? So let's start first with a brief PowerPoint presentation. Just briefly recapping from last time for those who have not joined us last time in Kyoto, and bring a little bit of a comparison between Kyoto and Tokyo. But we will start then. Charles, I see you already on the screen. Thanks for joining us. We will, in about 15 minutes, we will get back to you. So I switch now to the screen here. Okay. Sandra mentioned already, here we go. I have a project in Austria, not far from Vienna. It's the birthplace of composer Franz Liszt. The place is called Riding. It has a big concert hall there. It's a small village of 800 inhabitants, but next to it is the Franz Liszt birthplace. There I started a project with Japanese architects, and we finished a small guest house by Terunobu Fujimori, who designs in the tradition of Japanese architecture going back, I would say even thousands of years. I will show you in a brief moment, keeping those basic elements of fire, charcoal, wood, and raw tree structures. Those are the significant design elements of Terunobu Fujimori. Now we are here, I showed you last time, from Kyoto. The distance from Kyoto to Tokyo is about 500 kilometers, about the distance of Vienna and Munich, with one big difference, that the train takes only a little bit over 2 hours, and in Austria and Germany about 4.5 hours. So time and space shrinks here in Japan, and things develop very quickly. That was for those of you who haven't joined last time, that was our broadcast studio last time in Kyoto. Now it's a little bit more modern and dry. Now let's go back 14,000 years ago to about 400 years before Christ. They are still found, these potteries. They have these patterns of ropes. So it's from the Jomon period, and so that period was an American actually gave it the name Jomon period, that lasted over many centuries. And in that period, 3,000 to 2,000 years before Christ, the sea level was 5 to 6 meters higher. So 5 to 6 meters higher. So Tokyo was under sea at that time, and vast parts of Tokyo are still on artificial land, actually. where this modern architecture is built on. It's very controversial because of the earthquakes, and that the earth might, in a directly speaking, melt away directly. And that was always, over thousands of years, the basic structure of Japanese houses, a pit dwelling. You had a fire pit, you had these raw structures that held the roof. Some of you, in that time, artifacts were created like these dogu figures. Some of you probably, especially in Vienna, you know that writer von Däniken, and he had this crazy theory that those are actually astronauts that landed several thousand years ago. But I'm sure you have seen those figurines. These elements we have not only in Kyoto, the fireplace where you perform the tea ceremony, you still have these in modern buildings today too. Those were the traditional houses. Again, from the outside, inside you had the fireplace, you had this straw covering with an opening for the smoke on the top. And out of these, later on in years, so we are going back now, what is it, to 1,500 years, slowly out of these pillars, design elements developed, like here with the famous Ise Shrine in Japan. A very special particularity is that it's rebuilt every 20 years, also wood piece by wood piece, and renewed all the time. I mentioned last time this is this tradition lives on in Japan in a way that contemporary structures, family houses, are built basically having in mind that they last about 30 or 40 years, maybe 50 years, but that's maximum. That's because I think out of the facing the power of nature, if you have typhoon, earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis, it's easier to rebuild a soft-built house than a stone structure. So you don't fight nature, you live with it, and if it destroys something, you quickly rebuild it. That's, I think, part of the, in my opinion, part of the Japanese soul. I mean, these lectures, of course, or my observations are, of course, the opinion of a foreigner. Living here in Japan, Japanese might see things probably different too, but I basically, here we are in this vast sea of concrete houses, which appear actually to be concrete houses. They are, most of them, I think the estimate is about 70 or 80% of those buildings in a greater area of 35 million inhabitants. The structure is made of wood, so don't be distracted by the skyscrapers. Tokyo is a city not with one center, it has several, 6, 7 main centers that circle that metropolitan area. But as you can see, most of the houses are 3-story buildings, 4-story buildings, so not that image of a big skyscraper city. Of course, you have then these highways of concrete, but that's the opera building in Shinjuku, for instance, with 1, 2, 3, 4, and underground 5 in the middle of the city, intersecting highways running like 1 or 2 meters next to an apartment building. But those are the basic wood structures in Tokyo. Now, Tokyo, as you might know, at the end of World War II, was a completely burned down by the fire bombings of the Americans. And of course, the same thing. It was at that time, particularly, it was all the buildings were made of wood. And modern architects like Ryu Nishizawa, they continue too, of course, working with wood, but they create different styles. We talk about it then later, and why those could be maybe considered to be a typical Japanese style or not, and why it was so influential in the last 20 or I would say 30 years even. We talked last time also about one very important expression or definition, En-gawa. Now, En-gawa is in Japan. We saw in Kyoto that space between the living room and the outside, the garden room. There's a small walkway, you could say it. But it serves that to connect the outside with the inside. It makes the inside living bigger when looking directly to the garden outside. So it's also a little trick, I personally think, where Japanese know very well how to deal with giving the appearance in the building to be more spacious. Of course, you have to if you're very confined to small spaces. So you become, I think you have to be inventive where to store your things, but at the same time not interfering with design. So how do you combine all that? Limit the space. I don't know the name of that architect, but there are many architects who they get a little plot. This is how many square meters could that be? I don't know, 10, something like that. It fits in that niche. I don't think in Europe we would build anything in that corner. We'd probably put some, I don't know, maybe for the building some garbage bins or something. But he created this space. It's now a flower shop, and it gives the appearance to be much bigger just by making the ceiling higher. So this kind of inventiveness, I think, is, in my opinion, in Tokyo, that makes a Tokyo style, so to speak. We will hear it later what Julian Worrall, in the architecture critic, thinks about that. And then we have, of course, buildings like that, Kengo Kuma's Tokyo Stadium, Olympic Stadium, which was, of course, supposed to have opened in March, but because of Corona, all Japanese still hope that the Olympics will take place next year in summer 2021. The stadium is right next to the so-called Shinjuku skyline, one of those many centers. Then again, you have in the center in Tokyo, and that's in the so-called Shibuya area, you have concrete beds for rivers. They look like that. So the Tokyo has a multitude of appearances, from the high fashion and streets to just functional areas to make the city function, be it these concrete waterways or fashionable places like this. We will walk over them later here on Omotesando. This is by Herzog de Meuron, the Prada building at night. But you have lately also more and more rooftop gardens. This as well in Shinjuku, for people to take or businessmen to take their lunch breaks. And you have a monorail that, like most of the trains and highways, go right next to apartments. I remember when I first arrived in Tokyo, I was looking at apartments, and there was one sponsored by the city, so it was from the price quite affordable. And I looked at it, was quite spacious, and I was about to leave when outside the Shinkansen was passing by, that high-speed train. So, but means in the distance from 4 or 5 meters. So you have that throughout the city, this closeness to transport and living. You find, and I think that's what's another defining element in Japan, or let's say when you live in Tokyo, you have to find your little oases and niches, not only to make it livable and personal in this million mega metropolis, but more and more those spaces, they also are working spaces. We are actually right now here in one of these spaces in Tokyo that pop up more and more and allow to, especially for freelance workers, designers, creative people, to work throughout the city and in a way like vagabonds do, creating on the run. These So Fujimoto building, you have these kind of buildings too. And those are, of course, always present in magazines, in design magazines. So my personal opinion on that is that it's quite misleading, because, but I understand a design magazine wants to show extraordinary, beautiful designs and buildings. But if you only see that, as particularly as an architecture student, it might on the long run become very misleading of getting a certain, creating a certain image of a city, which is not true. Of course, they exist, but they are embedded in a very rough environment, in a day-to-day environment. And the building, of course, in itself is then kind of an illusion too, but it's part of that fabric. Here by Sana, the Pritzker Prize winners, Ryo Nishizawa and Kazuo Sejima, the Dior building, also on Motesando, where we try to walk them later. And then next to it, you have something like that. You have the electricity is not underground, even in the city in Tokyo, even if you have typhoons and earthquakes. And they are all held up by concrete columns. So we don't have that in Europe. If we have this electricity in the countryside above ground, then those are mostly wooden pillars. And all over Japan, you have that in concrete. So many people say concrete in Japan is the heroine of Japan, because in that way, just think how millions of concrete pillars there are. Combine that with with the concrete beaches that Japan has. They're all, it's very difficult to find, as most of the beach areas are all covered with concrete. So in that way, I think the government can control by dispersing money for construction projects to different provinces to guarantee their collaboration. It's a form of control. Of course, you have something like that too. It's very manga-like, colorful. You have this kind of districts, and this just a little bit about the feeling of Tokyo. We have now 5:30, and I would like to switch for a brief interview with Charles Glover, who is, I'm just getting out here of the presentation now. And how do I do that? Stop share. Okay, and we are back here again. Sandra, you will control that now, right? Between Charles and me, the conversation and the screen.
Yes.
Monica, she must.
We have one question by Caroline Ackermann.
Okay.
Caroline?
Hi. Yes. It's in English?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Or if you prefer in German, but English is better.
Okay. It's you talked about your project, I think it was called Rating in the beginning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And I was just wondering, because you said you brought in, like, you were keeping basic elements of Japanese architecture.
Mm-hmm.
As I've looked at, you know, like details from like Detail magazine about from like Japanese buildings and comparing them with buildings in our climate, there are really big differences of, as you said last time, you know, how people use heating systems and how the whole concept of living works. Is there any part of that, like technical aspect of detailing a certain, like detailing the technical aspect of the building that you could also balance out with each other maybe in this project, or was there?
So you're not referring now to Tokyo alone, you're referring to the particular project in Austria, right?
Yes, I was just wondering if you had, like, while you were doing that project, if you were trying to find a balance between those type of things, or if it was, you know.
Yeah, I think, of course, you have to find a balance. The biggest challenge is, of course, the Austrian building code, which would never allow certain things that are possible in Japan. And where I think that because of that lightness of certain aspects of the building code in Japan, those designs, extraordinary designs, are possible, which would not be possible in Austria. But it's not referring, of course, to earthquake safety, which that's a very strict code, for instance. But I think it leaves more open possibilities for style. Certain things are not possible to be built in the countryside in Austria and certain villages or so, and it would never be allowed. Where here you have more freedom with that. So in that way, we had to balance things out. From the technical aspect, we put in a fireplace. The building is a guest house, so it turned out also very interesting. You want to create something very romantic in a way, keep the style of Fujimori, down to earth. You have these charcoal walls outside and all that. But then you find out, if people as guests stay over the weekend, they don't want to bother so much with putting the fire on, taking the ashes out, and then you have the dust and all that. So it turned out to become more a nice place to light, to have a great mood in that place, which is great too. And we installed then electric heating. So you're talking about balancing things out. You have to, I think, go with the necessities, of course, first of all, that the people who are living in the building.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Roland. You can start with the first interview.
With Charles. Where is Charles?
I'm here.
Oh, here, I see you. Oh, this is. Thank you very much for joining us.
Sure.
And how is life in the movie world? Well, just to briefly introduce.
On pause. On pause.
On pause, like everywhere. We are dealing here, of course.
There's NHK has started shooting again, as you mentioned, the national broadcaster. It's kind of like, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's kind of like BBC and in the US PBS, kind of somewhere along that, on steroids. Shooting basically stopped in, I guess, April. And it started up slowly. I did a project in morning drama, and very, very strict, which made me feel good because I'm high risk, so I have to be really careful.
So are they? You have to wear them during filming in Tokyo.
I mean, yeah. What they do is the scene I shot was in actually in NHK proper, and NHK they take your temperature when you get in the building, but we all know that's a small percentage of caution. Then when you get to this actual studio, and you're supposed to wear a mask. Then when you get to the actual shooting, the sound stage, they take your temperature again, make you surrender your mask and give you a brand new one, which I thought was interesting. And they have entrances and exits, which are separate. And then you get in and you put on your own makeup, which I was happy to do, but surprised to see. And they kept their distance. And then you get on the set, and that's when they got a little not so safe. But yeah, when you got on the set, they put a face shield on you, and they put this contraption on your shoulders with a huge piece of plastic. So it was like a giant face shield, because, you know, when you're acting, you need to see the other person's face. So.
Maybe just to briefly, to explain students a reference to Tokyo. You saw the aerial view of Tokyo before on the picture, but we still manage here to have relatively, compared to Austria now and other countries in Europe, we still have relatively few cases compared. If you think greater area, as I said, 35 million around here, and you have a daily rate of, I think, what is it now, 200 cases a day?
In Tokyo,
but still.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean,
so
yeah. If I can just say one thing, originally I'm from the United States, the total number of cases in Japan right now are less than 1 day in the United States. So that gives you an idea. And I think some of it is the culture of masks here. Wearing a mask is not seen as strange, or didn't see. So I think that has to do something.
So making a connection then to I mean, when you came first to Japan, I remember, I mean, like we all did, living in a very confined space, relatively small. Does living in small places affect that behavior, maybe especially like this discipline? Or I mean, in other countries it might lead to some revolt, maybe, but maybe over the centuries or
maybe.
Yeah,
possibly, yeah. I think it has a great effect. I mean, as you know, having spent much time here, you rarely see fights in Japan. Now, I can't speak for Europe, but certainly not Austria. But fights are not that common, but you do see them, and when you do, they're volcanic. But people basically kind of get along and kind of, as the expression go, grin and bear it. You know, you take it in and take it in. And, so there's a lot of that. But people, as they're human, so they explode. But I think there's more getting along, and as they very commonly say here, following the rules is so important, as you have pointed out to me many times. You know, please follow the rules. Yeah. So.
But when you arrived, what were the biggest challenges in Tokyo for you arriving as a foreigner? I mean, has the attitude towards foreigners changed over the years?
Yes. Well, full disclosure, I lived in Kyoto for a few years before I came to Tokyo. So, but yes, it's a huge difference. I remember when I first came to Japan, very, very common to have people literally point at me. Oh, look, there's a foreigner. There's a foreigner. Look, and in Tokyo nowadays, this almost rarely happens. So, I think the society is getting more accepting of foreigners, but specifically things like getting a credit card you're still kind of looked askance, basically. But no, there's much more openness. There's also less of a surprise when you open your mouth and are able to speak Japanese. That used to be a surprise. Many people assumed you were a foreigner, you couldn't read or speak Japanese. Yeah, it's become much more international.
So in which way do you see, what makes for you Tokyo so special?
Oh, I would say the
others?
mood. I would say the mood of it. The fact that the different areas of Tokyo are so vastly different.
So you can easily escape if
you can escape, and
mood-wise,
it's like going to a cafeteria. You can go to Harajuku and get some of the youth culture and the latest fashion trends. You can go to Party Town in Shibuya area, or if you want some, what I consider to be refinement and visual relaxation, you can go to Shinjuku. So it's, when I first came here, that's what really struck me, was how different the different areas are.
Have you become yourself more disciplined because living in Tokyo?
Oh, for sure.
Besides, in case you haven't been disciplined.
Oh, no, that's a very good point. No, I have started to become. Tokyo's a busy place. It's as you lived in New York. We've both lived in New York. There are lots of similarities. Not still, in a bad way, but you have to be careful with your time, if time can get away from you. But
so based on your time living in Tokyo, how do you see the future of Japan? Does it further evolve, or is it, my impression is it's still stuck in a way in that tradition. The tradition, as we all saw it last time in Kyoto, that lives on. For me, the Tokyo is just one of those many shells that you have around your different appearances, but the underlying structure, the respect, that stays the same. Also, I think the cultural pull, the tradition is so strong that certain things are not being overcome in the future now, especially considering that China is now becoming the regional power here. So Tokyo and Japan will face a lot of things. But where do you see it going?
Yeah, no, you make a very good point. I mean, what was it? Just a few years ago, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. Now it's third after China. So I, just to use Kyoto and Tokyo as a comparison, a little nerdy lesson here in Japanese. The name Kyoto means capital, okay? And the real name of Tokyo is To-Kyoto, which means East Kyoto, which means the Eastern capital. And Tokyo itself to me, has changed so much more in the time I've lived here and over the centuries. And I think it's because it has to in some ways. Kyoto people are very proud of their culture, maybe too much. And I think they're complacent's not the right word. I think they're happy just to say, okay, we're going to keep on going. Tokyo has to. When 3/11 hit, the tsunami and the nuclear disaster hit, Tokyo stayed open. Okay, a lot of people don't know that around the world. Tokyo stayed open. The government knew they had to keep the economy going. Okay, so I think Tokyo is a little bit more malleable. It's a little more changeable because it needs to be. It has to be. Now, I know what you're saying about the culture and maybe a little stuck in the past, but I think out of necessity they have. I'll give you a good example. Go into a convenience store, okay? Recently, who do you see working there? Foreigners, okay? That's out of necessity. Maybe it's less desirable work. Now, maybe the local people don't like it, and maybe they don't, but it's a necessity. They kind of have to. So I think Tokyo is kind of being dragged, whether they want to or not, into being a more international stage, as it were. So I go to other parts of Japan and people are a little more like, oh, okay, we're fine the way we are, and oh, look, isn't it interesting, a foreigner, you know? So Tokyo's a lot more cosmopolitan, yeah, and a lot more like New York, yeah, in that way. And New York,
maybe
I think, not to get off topic, but New York is you know, it's very, very different. You go across a couple of bridges in upstate New York, and it's completely different, right? So Japan too, I think.
Yeah. Maybe one last question. You recently worked with Nicolas Cage.
Yep.
And so what guy is Nicolas Cage?
He's a good guy. He's a very good guy.
He's a good guy.
No, he is. No, he is. He might get mad at me saying this, but he really does talk like that all the time. So he's a good guy. Yeah, I did a film with him last fall, last winter. Just before last time I saw him, I actually gave him a mask. He wanted to go someplace, and when I was saying goodbye to him, I gave him a mask at the end of January. I remember him looking at it. So no, he's good people, as they say. He's a good guy. Very generous.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thanks, Charles, for some input from your experience here living in Tokyo.
Sure.
And I'll talk to you later.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Good to see you. Thanks. It's good to see you.
Thanks.
I do have a question, if possible.
Questions for Charles.
So is there a traditional part in the city of Tokyo that is comparable to Kyoto, and how is it comparable?
Good question. There's a place called Asakusa. It has a huge lantern that is below a gate, and it's in front of some traditional buildings. But to be honest with you, not many. There's not many traditional areas, and a lot of people might be angry that I say that, but no, not nearly as much. But I'm a little biased because I lived in Kyoto for so long. And Kyoto, as they say, there's a garden for every day of the year there, and that's true. So yeah, Asakusa, that comes to mind. It's the closest to kind of a traditional part of Tokyo. But yeah, Tokyo is very, very modern. So they're fond of tearing things down and building new ones. So buildings. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, any other questions? No. Thanks, Charles. Then I will continue a little bit with the PowerPoint. Okay. So we are back here. This is the, can you see that? I see that not on this, yeah, okay. This is the City Hall of Tokyo, built by Kenzo Tange. Now Kenzo Tange is, here we have a picture of him. Kenzo Tange is the great post-war architect, the father, they call him, of modern architecture in Japan. And as you can see with that City Hall building, this, I always say the style is kind of a techno-fascism, or you shouldn't say that, but it appears like that, this powerful towers watching over the people in Tokyo, pure concrete and with glass. But I always thought it's understandable that he and also Tadao Ando, which I'm sure you know, are so much in love with concrete, because they are a generation that experienced the destruction of war, Second World War. I mentioned, I don't know the exact numbers, but just in a few days, at the end of the war, Tokyo was burned down with incendiary bombs. I think it was about 200,000 people in one night, something like that. So that generation of architects that survived or grew up then in the aftermath of the war, I think unconsciously you want to create something that lasts forever, that cannot be destroyed that easily. So I see some people might disagree, an explanation for their love for concrete. I mean, you have that same thing with Tadao Ando, who is a much respected and celebrated artist, but here too I would make a difference between architecture that is kind of museum architecture and architecture where you actually have to live in, as architecture of public spaces, and architecture that you live as a person, as a human being, not as a meeting point for many people, as a place where you go in and out, but a place where you live. I draw a big difference, because do you want to live in a pure concrete building? I mean, we have many of these in Tokyo, and it starts with that. We talked about a heating system in Tokyo too. Most of the heating is electric. You have the electric heat on the ceiling, and it blows the hot air into the room, and it settles under the ceiling, but the floor is cold. Concrete walls turn wet. Windows in Tokyo too are mostly one screen, so you don't have two double glass window. I rarely see them. So building a house made of concrete for a family building or your private home, that's quite a challenge. So, but that's what most of these post-war architects used as a building material. The younger generation changed, of course, and with So Fujimoto again. Now there's the picture coming now. Yeah, the connection is a little bit slow. So Fujimoto here, a good example of, again, Ngawa, the connecting space between outside the living space. So what he did with this building is putting another building over the actual building. So again, it creates this high ceiling, it creates the feeling of more space, and it connects, here wonderfully described with the sky and the outside. But that's the young generation. They moved away completely from concrete. And of course, again, Kengo Kuma with his very Kyoto style lamellas and wood structures and beams. So there is a lightness in there that you cannot compare with concrete structures, of course. And it also means then that the experiences of war have moved far, far away. And you, as a younger generation, are free of that and dare to build lightly again with wood structures. You have Toyo Ito, of course. All these architects are represented in Japan. This building for fashion house Tardits. They're known for their shoes, mainly Italian leather fashion company. Here too, also within these structures, suddenly this lightness breaking open the building and connecting with the outside, a modern form of Ngawa, I would say. And here's a photo of Toyo Ito inside that Tardits building. I took that a couple of years ago during sunset. And going back to the Jomon period, as 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, to the straw fire pit building, basically a simple shelter. I even found a relationship to modern architecture to Ryu Nishizawa's museum. It's actually not in Tokyo, but on Awaji Island on the seaside. But he plays with that idea to of course, open up the space. Even if it's concrete, it doesn't feel that heavy like a tango structure. And the reference to the origins of Japanese buildings and living. I would like to make a little break again. And Sandra, is Julian online already? Let me...
I have seen her.
Julian, are you with us? Or maybe not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Julian Worrall, we have scheduled for 6 o'clock. He is an architecture critic, and he would join us from Australia, from Tasmania, where he is a professor for architecture. He is himself also an architect, and he had lived many years himself in Tokyo. So I guess we connect with Julian a little bit later. Sandra, you don't see him, right? Okay.
No, not yet. Is
Right.
Charles here still? No, he left, right? Charles Glover
Charles,
left.
maybe he left.
Okay.
But maybe there are, in the meantime, some questions for me from you.
Are there any questions?
I was referring more to the buildings materials in Tokyo. The appearance is mostly concrete, of course, city centers concrete, but the vastness of the building, the structure is made of wood. You, as maybe a question like that from my side, would you be interested to go to Japan as a student? Is it a top country to visit, if possible, in the future or as soon as possible for your studies? How much is your image of Japan defined by the magazine pictures? That's what I would be interested to hear from your side, your interest in Japan. So if maybe one of you could answer me to that.
Can you see the images, Roland?
Yeah, okay.
Pick one.
Yeah, okay. Share here. Okay. Well, how about this one? It's coming soon. It's the internet connection. Yeah. So that's another, it's called Garden House. So that's possible in Japan. You have the one important rule is you have to have a distance to the next building, which is, I'm not sure now, 30 or 40 centimeter. It's because of the earthquake, so that the building can move freely. So all buildings in Japan are not, they cannot touch each other. You cannot build wall to wall. And here again, I would call it this form of Engawa. You have the garden on the balcony, and the spaces inside is very small. So you have inside one etage, one floor is one room. I think it was about 10 square meter, a little bit more, something like that.
Roland, we have a question from Stephanie.
Mm-hmm.
Stephanie, can you post the question yourself, please?
Yeah. Is there any preservation of historical monuments in Japan? And how are they dealing with the destruction of these buildings?
Okay, I cannot hear you very clearly. Are you with us via your mobile or computer?
No, on the computer.
Okay, but you don't have a camera.
Probably it's the internet. I will turn off the video, then probably it's
No, or speak directly into the microphone.
Okay. Is there any preservation of historical monuments in Japan? Or how are they dealing with the destruction of these historical buildings for earthquakes? Are they rebuilding it?
Historical monuments are, of course, protected, and those are mostly, of course, temple buildings and shrines, which have been built and rebuilt over centuries. So if you go back to looking at the history of a particular shrine or the big temples, you always see they were destroyed by fire. Fire was one of the biggest obstructions, destroyers, besides tsunamis and earthquakes and all that. But they have been meticulously always rebuilt. I always think of this Ameisenhügel, this ant hill, which you step by accident in it and they immediately construct it and rebuild it again, that kind of feeling. No? From the other, okay, they are not protected, but it's regular family buildings. So I don't know if would be such a strict conservation law as we have in Austria. But again, as I said, buildings are considered to last 30, 40, 50 years maximum, and you live with the constant renewal. So in that, before I showed you the Ise shrine, which is rebuilt every 20 years, that's the perfect example for that lives on in the mind, I think, of the Japanese. So it's not tragic to get rid of the building, and you have a new generation there. And yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sandra, you sent to Julian the invitation, right?
Julian is here.
Julian is here.
Julian is here. Oh, great. Wonderful. Then I link here out. Where are you here on the screen? Oh, here he is. The Tasmanian man. So how is it all the way down the globe on the other side? You're pretty, I just talked to Charles before. I think you remember him too in your time in Tokyo. As I mentioned before, Julian was living many years in Tokyo himself as an architect and art critic, and is now teacher at the University of Tasmania. How is because I asked Charles before, Corona affecting your big island?
We are very fortunate in that there is no virus on our island anymore. So actually, for possibly a short time, but for about 3 months now, there has been no community transmission of the virus. The only cases here have come from outside travelers who have been returning, and these travelers are held in a hotel for 2 weeks or so until they can be clear from the virus. So actually, here in Tasmania, there is very little sense of the pandemic. We do not mandate to wear masks, for example. We do practice a kind of social distancing still, or physical distancing. It's kind of like a precaution. But everyone knows that for now, there is actually no virus on the island of Tasmania. It's an island. It's actually bigger than it looks perhaps on the map. It's about the size of the island of Ireland off the coast of Britain. It's about the size of Switzerland, but it is quite small in terms of population, about 500,000 people, like 500,000 people.
Well,
yeah.
Since we talk about Corona, you as an architecture critic and architect, do you think on the long run, if that virus is not getting under control, does that affect how we will build in the future? Are there already signs where you could see in daily life or in planning that a disease like that affects modern architecture on the long run?
You know, it's a question that is always coming up, and my thinking on this kind of has changed over the past maybe 8 months, but at the same time, the basic principle is the same. In the long run, I don't think it changes much, frankly. So I think that if we check back in 10 years' time, I don't think it's going to be changing our patterns too much. But in the short run, or the medium run, I think it's quite important. Basically, we will find a situation where we cannot really use our spaces as intensively as before. In universities, for example, we have to reduce our utilization of lecture rooms and classrooms to about 1/3 or 1/4 of what they were before. It really changes the way we plan. I'm involved in building committees at my university now, and it's a real challenge now to think about how we accommodate students in physical spaces. So it is affecting the way spaces that are currently here are utilized. What I think is the more substantial change is the familiarity with digital tools. So the fact that we can all meet like this suddenly, we're all somehow equipped to be able to do this, is really fantastic. And it means that we can do things that previously we were not really very familiar with or able to do. And now we're able to do it as a matter of course.
We had the possibility before, but why were we inhibited, or it suddenly went so quickly and it was adapted so quickly? Why didn't it happen earlier? Were there other interests?
Human nature. Yeah, it's a human nature thing. I mean, the fact that it became everyone was required to do it effectively by the situation meant that it accelerated the adoption of the technology. The technology was there, but it was not widely adopted. Now the adoption has happened, and so in that sense, it will make a big difference to the way people work and teach and learn. And I think it will make a big difference to how people occupy their houses, so their residential spaces. It's going to change the meaning of residential space, because residential space will also include workspace now. And I think it's going to change the way cities develop, because it will change the dynamic around the center of the city versus the periphery of the city. So these are my diagnoses of how the pandemic will change architecture and urbanism.
But do you think even if Corona is gone tomorrow, certain movements or developments or things we got used to, they will not go back again? So it will further develop in the direction we are going now, with or without the virus.
Sorry, you dropped out there a little bit. Just
okay.
If you could repeat
I say again. Yeah, in case Corona is under control tomorrow, the direction we chose now, we will not go back. We will continue going in that direction that you meant.
Yes,
as
I
a
think
new
so.
form of communication, the way we live. Yeah, there's no way back.
I think it is. It's a historical shift. It's a trigger or a catalyst for a historical shift, and I think that is something that we will, all of us in our generations, we will mark this year as before and after. It's like September 11, before and after. And so I think we will do things completely differently. Quite differently. Maybe not completely differently, but quite differently. But for sure, people love to be together. One of the interesting things is that what the social distancing and the lockdowns have revealed is just how much is lost in this kind of technological connection. Like embodied engagement with other human beings cannot be replaced by technology, cannot be replaced by screens. And so in that sense, as soon as the restrictions are relaxed, we have a vaccine, etc., people will do what they've always done for hundreds or thousands of years. They'll get together, they'll enjoy socializing and being together as human beings in their bodies, as well as being able to connect in this amazing way across the planet using the technology. Yeah, that's my view.
You lived many years in Tokyo. Can you say there's something like a Tokyo style? And if it exists, what would it be? How would you describe it?
A Tokyo style. I think the answer is absolutely yes. Even before I ask you the question again, as in which field are you talking?
Right.
Are you talking the field of,
let's say in architecture,
or fashion or architecture?
Yeah.
But in any case, whichever field you choose, or even every field, I think the answer is yes. There is a style. There's a manner, a kind of language, or a attitude, or a posture, which characterizes Tokyo, and it's even Tokyo as distinct from other parts of Japan. So for me, that is two things. Firstly, I think that there is a Tokyo style, but the style itself changes over time. So the style is not fixed. What was the Tokyo style in the 1930s is different from what it was in the 1970s, which is different from what it was in the 2010s. But at the same time, in relation to the rest of Japan and also the rest of the world, I think there's a clear distinction, or a clear differentiation between the Tokyo style and the styles, let's say, of other large cities, other big metropolises, or the style of other Japanese cities or Asian cities. Now, what would the Tokyo style consist of today? Yeah, that's a good question. Go on.
Maybe ask like that. If you break up those elements and you see those elements individually, could you then say they are a Tokyo style, that particular building? If you don't know which country it is, and you say, oh wow, I'm not talking about Kyoto or something, a traditional building, but a modern Japanese architect, one of those has been celebrated last 20 years. You put that building somewhere else and you could say, oh, this is still, that's a Japanese style. Can you say that? Or do they only become Tokyo style because they are all together in the differences and weirdness and.
No, I think it is. Yeah, it's a good question, Roland. I think that, let us say that there is a quality where you might get a diversity of experiences that hang together. And there's also specific individual kind of visions or expressions, which I think are connected with a Tokyo feeling. For me, one of the artists who captures the Tokyo sensibility quite well is Takashi Honma, the photographer. Do you know the photographer? So there's a kind of dry. I would say that there's a dryness. It's kind of dry, and a kind of a certain lack of emotionality. And I find that it's kind of connected, I think, to artificiality in some way. That there's a distance from the emotions and a distance from some kind of like grounded connection to experience in the Tokyo manner. It's artificial, it's constructed in some way. And I think that this is something you see over different generations and different expressions. Whereas if you go to Osaka or if you go to Kyoto, I think Kyoto is very bound up with its sentimentality around its tradition, and it has a kind of quality like you find in Italy, with that sense of a weight and rigidity of a tradition that is being sustained across many generations. And in the case of Osaka, I feel that Osaka is a place which is much more earthy, much more connected to the heart, to the emotion, to the belly, to the palate. It's a place of there's a lot of interference. I don't know where that's coming from, but yeah. And so for me, Tokyo is a more it's a more dry, maybe more artificial place in its culture. But this artificiality is extremely interesting. It's always extremely creative.
It leaves you, if it's so dry and with lack of emotion, as you say, it leaves you personally more space for you to express, or it gives you more room to express, I think. Because if you're surrounded by heavy Renaissance structures in Italy and all that, is nearly too overwhelming. So maybe that's why we chose to, in a way, that's the attraction also for us to, or in your case, you lived here, but I'm still here. This a certain neutral code that's around us, but that lets us breathe very easily. Actually,
I'm very, very pleased to hear your words, neutral code. For me, this term neutrality is a really key idea in understanding a contemporary quality, which I think for me is rooted in my experience in Tokyo, and it possibly is connected to also a kind of Asian urban characteristic. you know, I think the European sensibility is far more, as Roland Barthes would say, it moistens everything with meaning. But what we tend to find in the situation in a big Asian metropolis like Tokyo or Seoul is precisely this kind of absence of this moistening of meaning. This. In Paris, for example, or Amsterdam, or Vienna, for that matter.
Oh, Vienna, yeah.
Yeah.
We have 2 questions, please.
Yes, are they on the chat? I haven't checked the chat,
Yes,
so let's
but,
have a look.
Ines, can you ask a question?
Good questions. Yep.
So yeah, my question is, if you think that you have to be from Tokyo to design in a Tokyoan style, or if you could learn it?
So this is a question which is probably not a scientific question, and it's more of an ideological question, at least for me. And the answer, in terms of my own ideology or my own thought process here, is that you do not need to be from Tokyo to design in a Tokyo style. And for that matter, you do not need to be from New York to design in a New York style, or from Vienna to design in a Vienna style. So there's a looseness of fit in my ideological belief system, you might say, between the places that construct us and our capacity for expression or imagination. Of course, it's not a complete free landscape. It's still important to, one is still defined by one's environment and by one's background. But I think you can affiliate yourself to a particular place or a particular idea or a particular feeling. So yes, I don't think you need to be from Tokyo to design in a Tokyo style.
Okay,
you can absolutely adopt it. Yeah. Other questions?
Bilal?
Hi, I had a question in regards to social and public housing. If there is an equivalent that developed in Japan, or contemporary equivalent to what we have here in Europe?
I think the answer is kind of yes and no, but it does depend a little bit more on the specifics of your question, because when we talk about public housing in Europe, I think the situation in the Netherlands or in Southern Europe or in Sweden and so on, or Austria, is different from place to place. In Japan, there has been a long tradition of socially provided houses or public housing, particularly after World War II. Prior to World War II...
Stumm, ich habe versehentlich auf Stumm geschalten.
Okay.
Du musst dich wieder...
Also, okay, zurückschalten. Okay.
Do we need to close or?
No, I'm sorry. I was meant to say this. No, please continue your answer. Sorry.
Thank you. Public housing in Japan began after the 1923 earthquake that devastated Tokyo. There was an association set up in about 1925 called the Dojunkai. It's a mutual prosperity association, which consisted of urban planners and doctors and architects, social reformers, who got public money to construct a whole range of public architecture. And in the post-war period, there was so many homeless people, basically, as a result of the destruction of the war. There was central state provision of housing across Japan. Something like 4 million housing dwellings were constructed through that program. However, in recent years, maybe the past 20 years or so, there's been a strong push towards privatization of the housing provision. And the public housing, while there is still a public housing instrumentality, it's very much within a landscape of private provision, private sector provision of housing elements for profit housing, apartment condominium towers or other kinds of housing provision. So I think Europe, in Central Europe, you have a long and proud tradition of municipal provided housing development, and in Germany, German-speaking Europe, there's other patterns of communal or collectively provided housing. And these are not so common in Japan. It's more rather isolated examples here and there.
Thank you.
Katharina?
Okay.
Katharina,
Yes.
would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah, I have the question. So, what do you think? In which way will develop the Tokyo style, and is it possible that in the future it will take more influence from another countries like Europe or American? I mean, the design itself.
Japanese architecture, Japanese design is very closely connected to European and Western design. It's a continuum. All of the architects and designers are completely aware of what is happening in Europe or the United States or other parts of the world. It's a very well, let's say, lubricated culture with images and ideas from elsewhere. So I think if the premise of your question is that it will receive more influence than previously, I think it's always receiving influence. It has always received influence for at least 100 years now, and absorbed that influence and redirected it or been inspired or so on. So my understanding of the way this works, culturally speaking, is that Japan is a vessel which receives lots of influences and distills them or combines them and produces images or ideas and sends them out under the label of Japan to the rest of the world, which inspires the rest of the world. And then designers in Europe or elsewhere will be excited by what they find from Japan, and they'll adopt it into their own thinking. And so you just have a kind of a traffic back and forth between Japan and Europe. I think the distinction or the difference, the interesting difference in Japan is, this is a point that Rem Koolhaas has made, that in Japan, it's still possible to be a Japanese designer, and you can pretend or somehow adopt the idea that you are being Japanese in the way you design things. Whereas if you're, let's say, in Austria or in Berlin, it's very difficult to promote the idea that you are an Austrian designer or a Berlin designer or a German designer. It's a much more, let's say, globalized or yes, less localized kind of cultural feeling, I believe, in where you're sitting. So Japan still has a kind of weight. It still has a kind of, as a brand, it has a value.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Julian, could
Yes.
before I ask Anna, who is next, can I ask you now as a continuation, what would be the goals of a Japanese architect? What
Did you say the
does
goal?
he want to achieve with the building?
There is, I think the strong authors in Japanese architecture have a very developed sense of the discipline of architecture. In other words, they are working on problems, creative problems, possibly intellectual problems, but certainly problems within the form language of the discipline we call architecture. And they, with various clients or projects, they will define the problem such that it can engage that question. Like it could be a question around, for example, I think one architect who does this very well is Saw Fujimoto. Saw Fujimoto, I think, has a clear sense of the disciplinary questions that he's confronting as an architect. It really doesn't have anything to do with, for example, client needs or sustainability.
I will then later with you.
These kinds of questions are not so salient or relevant for such an architect. But what is relevant is an idea, for example, is how is the relationship between the inside and the outside? How can that be modulated? How can that be graduated? Or how do we understand ambiguousness of space? Or how do we create environments which have a quality of surprise or contingency, randomness about them? These are problems that really don't concern anyone except architects. They're within the scope of the architectural discipline. And in that sense, it's kind of like scientists or mathematicians or maybe musicians communicating with each other through their work. So in that sense, I think that the really committed Japanese architects have an excellent, really high level sense of their disciplinary focus, which is, you don't necessarily find it very often. You don't find it very often, for example, in the Anglo-American sphere of architecture. The objectives seem to be outside of the realm of architecture for many. They're in the realm of social benefit, or maybe relating to questions of kind of green architecture or sustainability. You know, these are not questions that are specific to the discipline as such. So in that sense, I think that that's part of the goal of any architect who wants to make his name or her name in Japan, is to engage these disciplinary questions. And I think this is one of the great merits of the Japanese scene.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you one more question?
Of course.
If it's Su Fujimoto is one current tradition architect, who would be an earlier one? Like, from whom to who? I think that you have this teacher system in Japan, right?
Yes.
A teacher is an important person.
Yes.
Who could be a teacher on that philosophy?
Well, look, I think Fujimoto himself is a rather interesting character because he didn't really have a teacher. I mean, he of course he had teachers, but his formation really was kind of independently developed. But I think somebody who's very important is unquestionably Toyo Ito, who you would all know. And Toyo Ito has been a really important, indeed a teacher of a younger generation of architects than him. Of course, Sana is the most maybe famous of that generation, but we also have many other architects who have been influenced by Toyo Ito, of which Fujimoto is one, and Akihisa Hirata is another, and there are quite a few other younger architects. I wonder who is the host of this meeting, because there is a lot of interference in my headphones, and
this is unfortunately it's Roland.
If the
turn it off then, right?
Because that is why I muted you before. Maybe you can mute yourself while you are not talking. Super.
Okay, that's very clean now. Thank you. So teachers, the other thing I think it's really important at this point to reinforce for the audience here is the discourse in architecture in Japan is diverse. It's not monolithic. There are great differences between the different tendencies within Japan. We have the habit outside Japan to talk about Japanese architecture as a single somehow concept or tradition, but it's a rich and diverse field, you know, there have been different attempts to map this diversity, a very let's say schematic but quite you know explanatory one is the distinction between the reds and the whites. Maybe Roland might have explained that to you. There's architects who are very red. Classic example is Fujimoto Terunobu, who makes these lovely idiosyncratic tea houses made of wood and lath and plaster. And then on the other hand, you have somebody like Ryu Nishizawa, who is extremely white and very abstract and intellectual. So the red and the whites, there's a spectrum there, but you also have spectrums between architects who are socially oriented and architects who are focused on artistic discourse. You have architects who come out of a orientation towards the city, like Tsukumoto, Yoshiharu, and Atelier Bauen, versus architects who are really focused on the object or in some sense of atmosphere. And so there is this diversity of positions within the field in Japan. So any attempt to make a generalization about Japanese architecture, at the same time, you always need to be aware that you've got these multiple ideas about what's important, what the priorities of the architect should be.
Thank you very much, Julian. Super interesting, but I have now two questions from the students. First is Anna, please, and then Shaima.
Hello. Hello. Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Or you can go first. It doesn't matter. No problem. Okay, great. Hi. So I wanted to ask you in what way your stay in Japan changed your work ethic when you came back, and if there are specific elements of that you've adapted into your current practice. As you've mentioned before, the diversity in the field and the way the architects, Japanese architects' discourse is very different. So what if that? So I was wondering if you could find some specific elements for yourself that you could adapt when coming back.
Okay. Yeah, I think your question is a kind of a personal one, and it relates to the way that Japan has contributed to my formation of my work and my identity, my professional identity. I would say to begin with that in some weird sense, I am Japanese. I have some Japanese flavor as a result of living in Japan for 13 years. And it's not just a chapter in my life, it's an ongoing engagement. It continues to inform everything that I am every day. So it's part of me. In terms of how it's specifically affected my maybe thoughts in the field, or maybe even my behavior, you mentioned work ethic. I mean, that was the term you used, and work ethic relates to the way one has an attitude to one's practice. I do believe that the experience of being in Japan equipped me with a relationship to doing architecture, which is really outside what I would call a transactional or an instrumental way of thinking about the task of the architect or the task of an employee architect. Architecture, in some sense, if you begin with the proposition that there's a distinction between buildings and architecture is the kind of cultural supplement to the world of building, in that sense, you could understand that supplement as a kind of a gift. It's a gift that's on top of the economic exchange. And to use a language which famously was developed by a writer named Marcel Mauss in the 1930s around the ideas of gift economies. So I think that at the very core of architecture is this notion of a gift, that there's a kind of generosity involved where you give something beyond that which is, let's say, immediately required or needed, or what is the function, or what is the demand from a client or from a situation. And the essence of architecture consists of that gift. Now, what is really interesting, if you read Marcel Mauss on the gift, or any secondary literature around it, is that Japanese culture and Japanese society is categorized, at least traditionally, as a gift economy, a gift-based society in which gifts given and received constitute the way that social obligation is developed and sustained. So in that sense, there's a kind of alignment between this idea of architecture as a form of generosity into the world of building and the idea of Japanese social interaction as a kind of exchange of gifts. So for me, I think that this has been quite an influential habitus, an influential atmosphere that you learn when you're in Japan, and which continues to shape you as a person after that experience. And so I think that in some sense, this sense of giving and receiving gifts in the world of architecture and in a broader society as being what you do, what one does, is something that I've been affected by from the Japanese experience. And it's a problem. It's a problem for me because not everyone feels the same way, especially here. I mean, like, let's say in an Anglo or a Western situation, I would say that many people are what I would call transactional about their interactions. It's like you pay me something, you're paying me for a service, I give you the service, right? It's a transaction. And, we define with the contract what the service is, and I fulfill that obligation that's defined in a contract. Now, that's a transactional relationship. And yet, I think if you define your architectural objectives around that kind of transactional mentality, you're not going to reach architecture ultimately. You'll be maybe a good business person, or you'll be a good service provider, but I don't think you'll really achieve what architecture is about. So there's a lot of chatter, for example, around the question of exploitation between senior architects and junior architects in Japan. And it's no question that if you're a Western student or graduate of architecture and you go and work in a Japanese practice, you'll feel exploited because of the fact that you're paid very little, you're working very long hours, and you don't seem to be doing anything that's of using your brain or using your talent, at least at the beginning. And this pattern of exploitation, or this pattern of relation, is something that is embedded in the Japanese structure of gift and obligation. Sandra mentioned earlier the teachers that structure this pattern of obligation from generation to generation. And it's really comes from this sense of a gift and receiving and giving gifts over many years, over decades, in fact. So I think that this is a big source of misunderstanding between a framework of values that might be sourced in a Western transactional position and the Japanese situation today. So I'll leave it there, but that's probably a really important aspect. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Julian. Shema, sorry, but we have to move on. I just got notice that our next guest is here and he hasn't enough, so we need to, I don't know, maybe Julian will come around later.
Julian, thank you very much. We could listen more now, but we're running a little bit out of time. If you want to stay with us, or if we have questions later, that's fine, depending on your time. We are having now Manuel Tardits with us, an architect from Yokohama.
It's lovely to see Manuel. Yes. Hey, Manuel.
I'm sure you know each other. The architectural world in Tokyo is not that big as the city itself. Manuel, thank you very much for joining us today. He has been for several decades in Japan. He's from France. He received many awards. He has his own architectural practice in Yokohama called Mikan. And maybe the first question for Manuel connects to Julian's observation. Julian says it's not necessary to be a Japanese to build in Japan. And I think that's the case in your case. You're a successful architect in Japan. Can you tell us about your experience establishing your own architectural firm as a foreigner in Japan? Oh, you must turn on your phone.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Great. Thank you.
So, first, I want to apologize to my dear friend Julian. Because I'm just cutting his speech. And I'm just sorry because I'm too teaching. I'm doing two teaching, so my students are still waiting for me. That's why I'm interrupting you, Julian. I apologize.
It's okay. It's fine. It's fine.
And the funny thing is that Julian and I are probably as far as you are from us, but we are nearly in the same time. So I'm north, he's south. Now with you and me, we are east and west. But me and Julian, we are north and south. He's in southern Australia, I'm in Japan. So much on the top of him. But we are more or less at the same time and more or less the same period. Okay, so to go back to, and once again, Julian, I apologize for interrupting you, because I think he already answered very nicely a few of your questions. Okay, to answer the question that Roland just asked me, I will summarize it very quickly. And of course, I'm more here to answer questions than to really impose myself. I've been here in Japan for 35 years. I arrived in Japan when I was your age. I was a student. I just finished my studies in France. I'm half Belgian. I'm not only French. I'm half Belgian. And I was working. I was living for many years in Africa. My parents were living for many years in America. So I'm not let's say a rooted French. I'm a French, but I'm not a rooted French. So I left France in 1985 at a time where the information you had about Japan were much less than you have now, because we didn't have internet, magazines, yes, but not so much. So the information was scarce. And one of the reasons I went there, I have many reasons, but one of the main reasons I went there is maybe someone you may know, though the inflation of informations keep putting the big masters that were our masters in the past. So you are now considering new masters, not our masters. And I probably came here not because of Fumihiko Maki, which was my professor at the University of Tokyo for many years. I came here because of Kazuo Shinohara. And Kazuo Shinohara, or Shinohara Kazuo in Japanese, is a person who was an architect, was a teacher, and his main achievement is houses. He was doing mainly houses. And of course, I still have the same question as requirement as during a few minutes ago. There's a kind of sound in the back. If you could make it a bit lower. Shinohara was the person, you can find Shinohara now on internet everywhere. He's more famous now than he was when he was living, if I may say. And the beautiful thing about Shinohara is when you are a Westerner, and I was a Westerner, maybe not so much now, is that you could see his houses. They were very simple. He's not a person with the geometry like Gunther Dominic, or it's not about difficult geometry. It's simple, but it was houses that I've never seen before. I could not understand when I was around early 80s, when I saw an exhibition, when I saw one book of his houses, I couldn't understand how anybody in his own good sense could do such a house. It was a mystery to me. I've seen many houses by Alto, whatever. I could always understand. I could see the houses, like it or not, trying to see how he would articulate the spaces and so on. I was looking at this guy, house, Shinohara's house, and for me was a mystery. How could you do a house only in earth and oblique, not flat? How could you do a house with all the major bedrooms under the earth? How could you do many houses that he was doing? It was not crazy. I couldn't think that this person was crazy. I could only think he was different, but I could not point it. I wanted to understand that. I'm not the only one. I know a very good friend, which is Spanish, had the same thing. He went to Japan to understand what was this space, this kind of space, why such an architect could do such a space. Look at the houses of Shinohara. I guess you will understand what I'm talking about. Simplicity, but something which is probably now a bit more known, but something which will really put you a big question. What is a house? For who do I do a house? who is going to live in this house? How are these people going to live in this house? How is it possible that a person wants to live in such a house? That was the big questions, and that's one of the main reasons I came to Japan. And when I arrived in Japan, the first thing was struck me was not really the architecture. Yes, of course, I like any student in architecture, any architect. I was an architect. I just finished my school in France. I was just a young architect, and the first thing who struck me and still strikes me, it was the city. I live in Tokyo. I've been living in Tokyo for the whole 35 years. So I've been in several parts of Japan, but I'm a person living in Tokyo. It's like you will be your entire life in Vienna. You will know Graz, you will know Linz, and so on, but you will be your whole time in Vienna. Okay, I was my whole time in Tokyo. So Tokyo is my city. It's more my city than Paris or any other cities in the world. So I'm a person from Tokyo. I don't know if I'm Japanese or not. I'm a person from Tokyo. When I arrived here, I was not. It was a new city. And I guess you know the very famous Italian architect called Santeglia. Santeglia is this marvelous architect who didn't make any building, but draw these fantastic views of the future, the city of the future. We are going back to 1914, around First World War, so a century ago. Santeglia did this kind of fantastic view of the future of the city. I was arriving 70 years after this book and this drawing were done. It was the first time in my life that I saw a city which was kind of showing in reality what was supposed to be the future of the city. That was Tokyo. And for many, many years, I was even more struck by the city than by the architecture. Of course, I went to see Shinohara. My wife is Shinohara's last student, so I'm strongly connected to Shinohara. And my partners were in the same school as Shinohara. So I'm strongly connected to Shinohara, but I was more struck at the end by the city than by the architecture. And of course, architecture, cities are made of architecture. We all know that. But for me, the shock was the city. And I guess Julian probably had also this kind of shock, and Roland maybe also. And when I say shock, I'm not talking about shock as a tourist. Of course, you can be shocked by a new city. You can go to Rio de Janeiro and find the landscape so incredibly inviting that you are shocked. I was talking as a planner, an architect. So how was, once again, such a city being possibly made by people, by engineers, by architects, by developers? How could you do such a city? And that was one of the big questions. I guess any of you coming to Japan will first be struck by the city, the infrastructures in the city, how the human imagination can do such a city. Okay, I summarized very quickly some of the very strong points that were my kind of first aims and my first discoveries in Japan. Did I answer your question, Roland? Partly?
Roland, you are on mute. Roland, nobody can hear you.
I'm back. I'm mute, yeah. Do Japanese clients expect something different from a foreign architect?
Julian answered you in a different way about a different subject, saying Japanese architecture is not a whole. You have different currents, different people. So a Japanese client is a client. I would say, if I make it, I answer very barely to your question. I don't see any Japanese client. It doesn't exist. I see clients in Japan, whether they are public, private. If you have a house is something very different than if you do a school. A house is you have. I'm saying it's very basic, but when you have a house, you are really facing a person in real with his own needs. When you do a school, you are working with a group of people, and some very often the people are not even the guys which are going to teach in the school. So it's different people. So to answer a question, I would say for me, but maybe also sometimes I feel that I've been too long here, so I'm not far enough Julian has sometimes, because he was keeping on going and coming. He probably has sometimes some longer view. I'm in the water, so it's for me more difficult to understand to tell you about water when you are in the water. But I would say, for me, all the clients are different. And if you have an archetypal client in Japan, I don't think so. What I just could say is, usually in Japan, you have less time to design than you will have in the West. I don't know about America, but I would say in Europe, usually have more time to produce a design that you have in Japan. We are always stressed by a lack of time, and I think this is the case with most of Asia. They give you less time to produce your design, to understand this, to make a story. Usually have less time. In China, it's obvious. Southeast Asia, I think, is the same, and Japan is a bit like this. It's not as worse as China, where you really sometimes don't have the time. You're just even slower than the guys on the site. In Japan, is not like this, but still you are squeezed, and that's also one of the explanation why we have such long hours here. And Julian just told you about if you come as a foreigner to Japan, you want to enter a big office, you may very well enter Kuma Kengo's office or somebody else, and you will be, of course, struck by the lengthy hours. Part of it is, of course, it's a way of living, it's a way of working here. It's also a client-related problem. I mean, less time to produce.
That was an example, difference of work as an architect in Japan. There are maybe one or two other examples that struck you as a big difference if you start working as an architect in Japan compared to Europe.
I think that Julian will not contradict me on that point, and I think it's also quite well known when you know Japan, is the quality of the construction. Quality of construction doesn't only rely on our shoulders, I mean the shoulders of the architects. It's the whole system who is working with you. For you, if you want to use it, what I mean is you have very competent builders here. But a builder is always as competent as you are. If you don't expect from him to make efforts, he will not do the efforts, even if he can do that. If you show the efforts, he will give back to you. The gift that is a kind of the gift that Julian was talking about. There's a kind of a moral gift. You give, they give. Then a Japanese contractor or Japanese building company will work like hell if you work like hell. If you ask him or her hell, they will answer. There will be a kind of pride of answering your question. And when I'm talking about questions, I mean technically things technically difficult to do. An incredibly light staircase in wood, for example, or a very difficult ceramic tiling wall, whatever, or a difficult concrete geometry. When you challenge people, they answer a challenge. You don't have, in France, very often it's difficult to get a challenge. You want to challenge them, people just, in architecture, they are angry at you. I mean, challenge is the thing that you ask too much. In Japan, I would say it's not, everybody is not the same, of course, but this challenging thing is something which is very central to the work we do. We challenge builders, and builders respond to us, and of course challenge us because they can do it. So there is this kind of thing, which is part of the quality you get in Japan. The only place where I know such a quality, and I don't want to be impolite with anybody, is, I would say, Switzerland. I think that in the Vorarlberg region in Austria, you have such a kind of quality. Vorarlberg is very, very close to Switzerland, of course, but it's in Austria. I don't know if my pronunciation is good, but Vorarlberg is, for me, is also one of these regions where you get a really good quality of construction, maybe also by challenging things. So Japan is, for me, this kind of extraordinary place where you have this challenge. For example, I will give you an example, and for me, it's really a heartbreaking thing. When you do a work in Japan, because of the condition that we have here, which are these earthquakes things, which make the engineering, the structural engineering, a central piece of any construction here. We know many famous architects usually don't know about the famous structural engineers who are our partners and who are they are one of the masterpieces that we need to have to work with us. So you make a house, you make a gymnasium, you make a stadium, you make a little hotel, you make a tiny building. You will work hand to hand from the very beginning with a structural engineer. It will be part of the in your mind, in his mind, the space will be partly built because of the structure. So when I do a building, we nearly kind of always start by the structure. And it's kind of an evidence in Japan for many people. It's not so evident in many countries. In France, for example, and that was something I was saying, it's because I'm French, it's heartbreaking. When you want to speak with work with structural engineers, the guys take takes the time and you pay. You start by paying. People count their time. In Japan, you don't count your time. You don't count your time. You ask the engineer, you call him now at 9 in the evening, he will be there, he will answer. You have a beam, you want to reduce your beam by 3 centimeters, which maybe looking like a little detail. He will calculate and say, okay, you can get your 3 centimeters. And it will be a much nicer beam. The result will be a delicacy for your spirit and for your eyes when you look at the ceiling. In France, I'm doing a house at the moment. We've been working on this house for 1 year. We still not have been able to work with the structural engineer because it's too expensive to ask such a guy. So we first do the building, the basic building, the basic drawings. We will ask this guy after. Nonsense for me. Building is, for me, part of the building is the structure. Julian was talking about the fact that in Japan, we in architects are really much in the rhetoric of architecture. And for example, they are less interested by the social aspect and these kind of things, which I totally agree with him on. Of course, you may have difference between architects, but basically what he was saying, I agree with. So I would say that we are more interested by structure than by mechanicals. The way you do with the climate and these kind of things, I would say we do it in a very simple way. Open windows, a better insulation, they're very basic, but this kind of, but it's not a central part of our teaching. It's not a central part of our concerns, the sustainability thing. We are more, I guess, because of the country, because of the geography, we are more about the structure, even though some architects, of course, may think differently than I'm thinking, but I think it's a tendency.
Roland, du musst dein Mikrofon bitte wieder einschalten, danke.
Okay, thank you very much for that very interesting comparison, Japan and France too. From your experience, would you, as an architect, recommend foreign students, like in Austria, to at least come once to Tokyo, see the town, see the city, because it's important for their further development? Or is it enough to get to know the buildings in Tokyo and Tokyo from magazines and architecture books?
Never. Wherever you are, never. If you want to understand what Gunther Dominic is doing, you go to see his building. If you want to see what Koop Himmelblau is doing, even if you dislike very much Kopfhimmelblau, you go and see it. Then you can talk about Kopfhimmelblau. But if you talk about Kopfhimmelblau, I'm just taking an example of Austrian architecture. If you talk about Kopfhimmelblau without knowing it, without having seen the real thing, you're talking about nonsense. You don't know it. It's the scale, the atmosphere, it's the materials, it's the way they interact with each other. And of course, if it's Japan, you go to Japan. I will give you one example, one little example. The tea pavilion. I think Julian mentioned it. A tea pavilion. A tea pavilion is one of the tiniest space in the world, in the world of architecture. It's about 3 meters by 3 meters. 3 meters by 3 meters. It's just like a simple box of 3 meters by 3 meters. It's a very dark box. It has only a few windows. There's no way you can buy some books about Japan. You will always find photos of beautiful tea pavilion. What you see is just a total recreation. There's no way, I'm telling you because I discovered that by myself. No way you can see and understand a tea pavilion in a magazine. It's too small, I mean, just physically speaking, it's too small to take a picture of the real space, because if you take a real picture, you have a fish eye, so you deform the space. It's too dark to take a picture of the space, so you need to put some lights which are not natural light. So this very example of a tiny pavilion is, if you don't enter this pavilion, if you don't sit in this pavilion, there's no way you can understand this space. And I would say the same thing for any other building. The scale, and for your generation, maybe Julian is just at the limit, and I'm really at the limit. We were working hand drawing. We're not working with computers. I started finding computers in the very early 90s. I was taught architecture in the late 70s and the whole 80s. So you have to make a plan of 1 to 100. You have to make a plan of 1 to 50. You have to make a plan of 1 to 200. You know, you have to do it by yourself. You know the scale you are working with. If you have a computer, you're on a screen, you have no idea of the screen. You have absolutely no idea of the scale. That's why, once again, you need to go to the real thing. On a screen, you don't understand anything. I mean, when I look at Roland, I don't know if Roland is 100 kilograms or 10 or 50 kilograms. I have no idea. I see Roland. I'm not able to tell you if this guy has an enormous head or a small head. You have to, same thing with Julian, but I know Julian. I know he has an enormous head. You have to go to Japan if you want to know Japan. You have to go to see Maki, Ito, Fujimoto, all these guys and others, Kumakengo and so on. You have to go and see them. And that will be the same for any piece of architecture in the world. Though in Japan is, of course, a bit more foreign to you than Austrian or Swiss or Italian or French architecture. But it's the same thing. You have to go and see it, experience it. So you are probably having you have surely much more information than we ever had when we were your age. But the information you use, for me, is of poor quality. It's just a hook for you if you are clever enough to tell you, okay, I must go and see it. I see a wonderful library in Arizona. I want to go and see it. I see a wonderful building by Kumakengo in northern Japan. I want to go and see it, and so on. So I'm probably saying something which are very simple and very basic, but I think sometimes you have to return to this kind of what architecture is, and it's the really meaning of architecture is a very simple gesture. It becomes very articulate, it could become very articulate, very refined, very complicated, but the basic thing is something very simple. And you have to see it.
Maybe I should rephrase my question. Would foreign students miss something if they would not go to Tokyo? Is their theoretical visit to Tokyo, does it have such an impact that it would also influence their work. From that point, what would you recommend? Of course, you have been living here long. You probably will say visit it but does it have that strong influence, more stronger than like visiting New York or a Western metropolis in that size?
I mean, it's not the problem. It's not the problem of saying this town is better than that town. You can, when you go with, I mean, I've seen it. You go with your Japanese students. You go to Venice. Everybody, including yourself, you're just like, oh, my goodness, what is this incredible city? You go to Venice. Okay, Tokyo is proposing you a different scenario. It's a very different scenario. This city has basically a very hollow history. It's been destroyed twice in the 20th century. So many old buildings. You don't have many old buildings. You have the history is still there, of course, because the streets patterns and some things are remaining from this history. But still, it's a city which is not more than 400, not older than 400 centuries. It was started from nothing in early 17th century. So it's a very shallow story. And of course, because it's been destroyed a few times, it's even shallower. The extraordinary power of Tokyo is the modern Tokyo. And I would say that it's for me, the greater thing that I can see in Tokyo, there are a lot of things, are the impact of the infrastructures. The impact of the infrastructures on the city. And when I say infrastructures, I'm not only talking about motorways, railroads, which are crossing the cities at any levels, which is already something totally amazing if you compare to most of European cities, where you don't have this incredible infrastructure just going through the city. So it's a city which is reshaping itself all the time. So it's quick. It's changing quite often. I mean, the buildings, they are training. It's a quick evolution. The impact of the infrastructure is extremely strong, and as a figure of style, it's something which is really amazing for us. And when I was saying our infrastructure, I was not only talking about human infrastructure, that these things done by the human. You could, if I put in infrastructure rivers, I would say that one of the most incredible space I know in Tokyo, and probably I've never seen it in the world, are some of the major rivers in Tokyo. Imagine the river that you have in Austria, or in Paris, or in London, or in Roma, or Moscow. Any river that you know crossing a city. It has a size, it has a width. Then you take, and you have banks, like in Rome, the banks are not very used. In the Thames, in London, the Thames is kind of a rough river. In the Seine in Paris is more gentle, so you have people next to the river. And now you take one of the major rivers in Tokyo, the Tama River, for example. The Tama River is something like 120 kilometers, something like this, going from the sea, just goes through Tokyo to the mountain next to Tokyo. This river crosses in the middle of the city, the biggest city on Earth. We are 40 million people here in the same big city, in the same metropolis. Okay, so you have this river crossing the biggest city on Earth. This river is something like half a kilometer wide. You have kind of walls of earth on both sides, and the river bed itself is half of that. The rest of the river is nearly 100 kilometers of sports grounds, of place where you can rest, go with your friends, walk, take bicycle. You have these incredible natural elements within the city. This is also an infrastructure, not a human-made infrastructure, though the human, of course, kind of worked on the sides of the river, but such a kind of natural infrastructure or relationship between the nature and the city is something for me unknown in any Western city. And that's also one of these, I call it infrastructure. I don't know if infrastructure is the real word for it, but this relation between nature and the city is also one extraordinarily striking point for any foreigners. I've brought to this so many architects. They were always kind of surprised. It's totally anti-urban because it's half a kilometer of nothing else than green and water and green, and it's completely in the middle of the city. So the question of urbanity, the mixture of what is urban, what is not urban, is something central to Japanese cities, and that's striking for us. The kind of anti-urban space that we'll find really in the middle of the urban space. These things basically don't happen in Europe. And that will be, when I think, one of the reasons why, if you go to Japan, to end by really answering Ron's question. Yes, you have to go to Japan if you want first to see some very refined architecture, and if you want to see another kind of cities. Of course, you can go to Lagos or some cities, other cities in the world. You will find also some extraordinary example of cities. But the Japanese city, and especially Tokyo, is really one of the examples that you have to have in your mind. Venice, yes. Wien, yes. Roma, yes. Paris, yes. Tokyo is one of them, definitely. For different reasons, but definitely, yes.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I haven't been lately in Yokohama, so I hope I can see Yokohama soon and catch up there. Thank you very much for your time. We will continue now with that. I hope we will see you soon. I think I will see you earlier than I will see Julian, unless he is. I guess so.
We are itching to get back to Japan, but as Australians, we are trapped. We are prisoners in our own country. We cannot leave.
Right.
As soon as they open the borders, we'll come back.
Oh, you're not allowed to go to Japan? I don't want.
Manuel?
No.
Yes. Manuel, we have one last question. Is this okay, Roland? Can we?
One more question, and then we continue. We have to.
One last question from Katja.
Okay.
And maybe Katja can put this question to Manuel and Julian. Katja, do you want to ask the question yourself, please?
Yes, with pleasure. I was thinking about, so when you arrived in Tokyo, because you were talking about, so the students have to go to Tokyo and see the architecture, then experience the buildings. By which building or which architecture were you most enthusiastic when you arrived in Tokyo? That would be interesting.
I think Julian and I arrived at different periods. I arrived in the mid-80s. I think Julian arrived probably in the early 90s. So even a period of between 5 and 10 years is different. So the architecture you going to see is different because of course you can go to see all architecture, which were there for many, many years, but you will go to see the masters of the game of the time you arrive. At the time I arrived in Japan, there was Shinohara for me, as I told you, the god of houses in Japan. Shinohara. There was also Maki. Maki was my professor, and he's done very refined buildings. He's now very old and still working. He's 92 now, but he's still working. And but I would say Maki at that time. I went to see some buildings by Tange, Kenzo Tange, the great architect of the modern period. He has left some beautiful gymnasium for the Olympics of 1960 in Tokyo. So Tange, Maki, Ito was Ito was doing Toyo Ito was doing small things at that time. He didn't have his big buildings came after. I mean, he had done very, very interesting small houses, but the main building that you may know from him are a bit later. But I was definitely, of course, recommend to see some of the very refined building of Ito. And of course, you have all the new names that you know, Sanaa, Fujimoto. Fujimoto doesn't have done so much work in Japan, but you have new names. But if you talk me about my period of arriving to Japan, I told you, Shinohara, Ando was also a big name. It's still a big name, but it was not so much in Ando is from Osaka, which is a different city. So you had to go there, and he didn't at that time there was nearly no building of him in Tokyo. It's a bit like this. In some countries, you have some kind of adversity between big cities. Osaka and Tokyo were never very friendly to each other. I don't know if Linz and or Graz and Vienna don't have the same kind of problems, but like Paris and Lyon or Paris and Marseille had this kind of opposition. So an architect from Osaka will not work that much often in Tokyo. So when I arrived in Japan, Ando was already a very big name, but it was mainly concentrated in the area of Kyoto and Osaka. It was really different. So I guess now Julian can talk to you about a different period of time, maybe different people.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I think, are you okay, actually, Roland, in terms of time? You mentioned time was an issue.
I'm sorry, I was definitely impolite to Julian because I interrupted him, and I'm going to be once again impolite because I have to go back to my students. They are waiting. So I'm sorry not being here for longer. I mean, I was supposed to see them at 6:30 and 7, and so now 7:30 in Japan. So
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manuel. And we catch up later. Okay. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. And I know you're going to do nice things and say nice things. I apologize once again. All my apologies.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much. Thanks. So we are having, Sandra, we are having 7:30. Wow. Was a very interesting talk. And maybe also, Sandra, I sent you before the, I think, Facebook pages and maybe homepage too of our guests. So maybe you can put these then during, while we are talking now on the message board for everyone to see.
Yes.
Then we have that too.
We have now.
Yeah, we have now half an hour. We have now our last guest, Maiko Gundermann, and then we go with her outside to the street. So we have to do that now in a compact half an hour session. It was really great now from the insiders, of course, art critic Julian, an architect, foreign architect in Japan, to get that input. I mean, myself, I'm not an architect. I'm writing about architecture, how I see it on a more entertaining level. I would say lifestyle magazines. And doesn't mean that I don't go as deeply, I cannot go as deeply as Julian might describe it. But also Charles to have some input from this overlap between life and work and architecture and how it affects us. And I welcome now, okay?
Yeah.
So we share now live here with Maiko Gundermann. She is originally grew up in Berlin.
Yes.
We met quite a while ago for a production for Issey Miyake, and Maiko has this interesting background of having grown up in Germany, having lived long time in Hong Kong, and finally coming back kind of to the roots where you or half of your parents grew up. Your mother is Japanese and your father is German, and Maiko is a translator, interpreter, also works for a Japanese television station and NHK.
Yeah.
And maybe the first question, so how did coming back to the roots of your ancestors. Did you imagine that the way you experienced it when you came from Hong Kong? You didn't come directly from Berlin, you came via Hong Kong there. And I think we have to, just a sound check. Sandra, you can hear us both, I hope, yeah?
Yes, very well. It works.
Okay, great.
Okay.
All right.
So I never really saw it as coming back to my roots, actually. I was familiar with Japan since my childhood because I spent most summer holidays in Japan, like mostly every year as a child. So I was already very familiar with the way people think or how Japan is, and especially Tokyo because my mom is from Tokyo originally. Yeah.
But still, what are the biggest, are there things that you did not expect? I mean, you have visited Japan before.
Yes, challenging things.
Challenging things that, well, that you haven't been confronted to in Berlin, where you grew up, and which you definitely have to relearn certain things. And
right. So I guess that is more like, I mean, concerning or regarding the mentality or the way people think. Even though I already knew how people are in Japan, or I thought I knew the Japanese mentality, but Japanese people are really reserved and value their privacy. So it can be kind of hard to get to know new people on a deeper level. Like it tends to stay on a quite superficial level. So I think that's the biggest challenge that I encountered in Japan. Yeah, so if you, for example, have work colleagues, they will mostly stay work colleagues and not really become really good friends in most cases. Or if you have kids, and if you get to know parents of kids that go to the same school as your kid, you won't necessarily become friends with those parents. You will just talk about everyday stuff with them, like, but it doesn't really go further than that. So it's kind of, yeah, it's quite easy to become lonely, I think, in Japan in a way, especially in Tokyo. I don't really know the other cities because I have never lived in any other city apart from Tokyo, but
quite different to Hong Kong then.
Yeah, I think people in Hong Kong are more direct, a little bit louder, you could probably say. They're not so reserved, you know, and you can kind of tell what they are thinking in Hong Kong. Like, yeah, it's you don't have to guess what you know the person is thinking, or yeah.
Now, do you feel you have two souls in your inside you, the European or the German and the Japanese? And over the years, did that switch inside you, or you were thinking about it and now you came back to Japan? You are drawn more to the Japanese side. How would you describe that?
Well, it's interesting because when I grew up in Germany, I felt my Japanese side more strongly than now.
You mean under pressure, or did it come?
No, just in
naturally?
general, I felt more Japanese than German while growing up in Germany.
Oh, okay.
And I guess that has to do with the fact that I was raised with like Japanese customs and values at home. And then when I moved to Hong Kong, I kind of started to realize my German part more. And now in Japan, I think I kind of feel even more German. I guess people, they realize the differences, or like those aspects that are not the norm in the society they live in, that are highlighted. I think that goes for anyone. So that's probably why I feel that way. So it did change over the time. Yeah, definitely.
If you, I mean, age is, well, let's say it in that way, because we have this project in Riding, a little town in Austria. And I see that problem all over the world. The young people leaving the countryside, left behind are the old people. And you have the same problem in Japan too. But if you consider, where would you rather get old? I mean, we know there is a respect for the old. We still have that there. I think this is also one major part of Japanese culture and tradition, that no matter, we see it even with the architects, no? That I mentioned it last time, that the age is very important, and even if the younger architect is more famous, but if you would be, if you would have the choice to retire either in Japan or in Germany, where would it be and why?
I think I would choose Germany.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm not talking now about the care system and all that, but from the mentality. You would rather choose that?
Mentality, that's a tough question. Because I think mentality-wise, it's easier probably for me in Japan right now. But I don't know, I just want to go back to where I came from, I guess, or where I know
where you came from.
Yeah, but I was born and raised in Berlin, so I know how things are done. And there's no gray zone in German, like in the German way of thinking. In Japan, you always, there's a lot of gray, like not white and not black. And you have to think a lot, like about what would that mean now? Or what does that person try to say? What is it? Yeah, what is he or she trying to say? Or
I guess this gray zone, what you're talking about, that refers again to the Engawa space. This is exactly the space between building and outside, this very vague area, not black, not white, very diffuse place. So actually, that's why I invited you, because you represent both sides of the world, and building, constructing in Japan, of course, you have to take into consideration the way people live here and what their needs are, but also their feelings in a way. So in that way, it was very interesting to hear from you. So you're both sides in that way. We are running out a little bit of time, and we try now our technical experiment in going outside on the street. Before we go, I would like to mention, maybe last time Sandra put my homepage, it's very easy. You can download this book for free. It's on the first page of my homepage, hagenberg.com, and it features 100 spots in Japan, interesting architecture and design spots in Japan that I recommend. It was published by the Japan Tourist Association, and you can download it for free. It's in English for that. And we'll take a brief break, Sandra, maybe 1 or 2 minutes to get our equipment together, and then we go outside to the street. And we will do that with a phone, and Michael has to log in probably, because we do it over his phone, and then we...
Roland?
Do you have to...
Yeah. Before we go out, please, we have 2 questions.
Okay.
To Gundermann, one from Cleo, and the second one is from Anna. Please, Cleo, and then Anna.
Okay.
Yes, so I was wondering, what are the Japanese values that you felt highlighted back in Germany and vice versa in Japan, and how does it influence your work?
My work, okay.
Your values.
Values.
That you valued in Japan, in Germany.
In Germany, I guess like respect for the elders, or not talking back to your parents, always being polite to people in general, holding back with your opinion, and what else? These are the things that I was brought up with in Germany. So these were kind of highlighted there. And right now in Tokyo, I mean, it's not like my values have changed or anything, but what I see highlighted is probably my spontaneousness, or like friendliness with foreign, like strangers. This is something that you don't really see much of in Japan, because people are, as I said, very reserved and very super polite. So it's not like you can have a casual chat with anyone on the street, or which is quite common in Europe, I would say. So yeah, this is some, yeah, these are some points. I don't know if that answers your question, but work-wise, it doesn't really influence me, because I've always worked with Japanese and German and also English, but I've been doing like interpreting and translations. So it doesn't really matter where I am. I mean, work-wise, I don't really change my personality or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I hope it answers your question. I'm done. I think
Frage, also?
Ja, da war, glaube ich, noch eine Frage.
Yeah, sorry, we were setting up everything. Is there one more question, Sandra?
Yes, there would be one from me. Okay, hello. So I recently learned about the term, correct me if I pronounce it wrongly, hafu or half.
Yeah.
And
so
I was,
for me.
Yes, for you. And I was wondering, when you came back, if you faced any sort of racism, because as far as I understood, this term was maybe not, had not a positive connotation. So I was wondering if you had any experience with that, or not at all. Thanks.
You mean in Japan?
Yes.
If I've experienced anything negative? No, actually not at all. And I think that also has to do with the fact that I wasn't born here or raised here. I know a lot of half Japanese people who grew up here and who did face like difficulties at school because they look different, or yeah, mostly because they look different, because most of the time they spoke Japanese fluently, and their mannerism and everything was very Japanese. But Japan is a very homogeneous country, society. So everything that looks foreign or sounds foreign or feels foreign is kind of rejected. That's like their natural response to things, unfortunately. But like half Japanese people have become more and more in the recent years. So it's becoming less of like something unique like it used to be when I was a kid. That was more rare back then. But in Germany, I didn't really face any kind of racism, obviously, as you can kind of probably imagine. But yeah, for grown-ups, it's a different story in Japan, because, as I said, people are very reserved. They don't really talk about this stuff unless they really know you. So no one would just come up to you and say, hey, you look non-Japanese, and you know, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't really, yeah. They sometimes they ask you, are you half Japanese, but that's mostly, most of the time it's like in a positive way, or because they're genuinely interested in your background, and it's not like negative at all. Like it doesn't have a negative connotation. at least that's my experience. But as I said, those having been brought up here, they might have had a different experience. And it also depends on where in Japan you go to school. If you live in a very rural area, like in the countryside where there are no foreigners whatsoever, of course you will stick out, and the kids might make fun of you more easily than if you go to a more international environment. Like if you go to a school in the center of Tokyo, or for example, they tend to have several half Japanese students now, I think. I mean, I can't generalize it, but it's becoming more and more like normal. Not normal, but nothing to pick on.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know where Roland went.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah.
Roland, we're ready.
Okay, we were just trying to, I have this feedback again on this one. Okay, so this one, all right. Okay, great. Then Michael, you will stay here and we hit the road.
Yeah.
And first we switch. So does...
They're already on, so she can switch. They're already streaming. So you just have to put in the headphones and go.
Oh, really? Okay, great. So we will see you on the street shortly.
Okay, this does not work yet, right? Maybe. Maybe it works when they're outside.
We are nearly ready. Wait.
But Roland, are you already a participant?
0906. Just
0906.
Yeah.
0906. You just keep wearing that. It's coming out of it.
But is this also streaming visual? No. Can you hear? No?
What?
What? Okay, but you should be able to, okay.
If it doesn't, if something
You can
collapses,
do it now.
you just put it. Yeah, I know, but we can't tell if no one's talking, right?
That's what I can tell you. Okay. There you go. Yeah. Okay, and we can start the video. And Sandra, you switch to, does Sandra switch to this?
Yeah,
Roland.
I can see it. Then I turn this user
Ready?
mute now.
Yeah. Right, we got it. Okay.
Okay.
So
Zoom. Okay, now we should hear the iPhone in a minute. I can see it, but I cannot hear it. So, Roland, I cannot hear you. I can see you. You are a participant. Maybe I should make you host. No. Co-host. I cannot see. We cannot see an image. Can anybody see an image of the iPhone? No. I cannot see it. Okay. I think they will have
Man kann ein Bild sehen vom iPhone schon.
Aha, wo ist das? Oder, okay, kann man schon sehen, gut.
Ja, wenn man in der Galerieansicht ist, also Roland Phone sehe ich.
Okay, das ist gut. Ah ja, stimmt, ich sehe es auch. Es ist hat nur noch keine Lautstärke. Ah, okay. Roland, your iPhone is not mute, but somehow you have to turn the volume on. Also, wir sehen dich schon. Okay, Roland? No. Wir hören dich nicht, falls du uns hörst. Okay, Sie probieren noch was, so wie es aussieht. Roland. Okay. Nein, wir hören nichts. Okay, das wird nur mal ein paar Minuten dauern. Die haben das sicher gleich. So, wir sehen wieder was. Okay, Sie sind draußen. Gut, wir sehen nichts. Naja, möchtest du es ein Versuch? Okay, ich probiere ihn. Okay, er hebt nicht ab. Roland.
1 minute, you have to switch, sorry.
Maybe, Roland, if it doesn't work, we do it this way, that I call you and I hold my phone to my micro.
Yeah, that's possible. Yeah.
Oder?
Okay, why don't we do that? Shall we do it? You figured it out? Hold on a second. Otherwise, we do it. I speak into the phone with the WhatsApp, and she holds it, and I just go.
Everybody can hear you now.
Yeah.
I hope. Can everybody hear him?
Yeah.
Okay.
Test from Tokyo. From there. Yeah. Then just do the video. Yeah. Okay. There you go. So we have, but can you switch it back to not me?
Okay, so now the sound is not good. Okay. Yes, for sure it's not good.
I'm not really.
But well,
so I'm explaining now, but you can explain a little bit, or I can explain a little bit. Okay.
Okay. Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's try. So let's get out here. This was the space, one of the working spaces here in Tokyo I told you about. Little niches, and out we go. So we're in the Shibuya district. Here you see also one of these working spaces here. You have here recreation space. It's quite cold already, actually. And food stalls. One of these many oases, but more and more focusing on outside because of Corona. And we're coming now to the Omotesando, and we will try as quickly to walk as quickly as possible to Herzog and Demeron architects. Prada building is those are Swiss architects, not Japanese architects, but that building has become quite a symbol for this area of the so-called Omotesando. We are nearly there on that street. It's lined up with buildings by all well-known architects. But actually, they were already built 15 years ago when they were the young and upcoming architects like Junaoki or Kingokuma, Furukawa, one of the older generation architects. And we are heading now in the smaller part of the Omotesando. And wait a bit here. They are exercising a little bit on the street here. And we are nearly down at the Prada building. This is the typical subway entrance here in Tokyo, Omotesando. You can see people and lined by the fashion houses, the street. Everyone wearing masks here. And here, one of the 5 or 6 Issey Miyake stores. They are all lined up here, all very sparse, minimalistic. You don't praise the product by screaming it out into the world. You place it like an art object in the space, the Issey Miyake store here. Then, do we still have light? Yeah, it's still lit. Down. Are you often here in that area?
Yes, I love
yes. It. But you don't live very far away from here, right?
Yeah, I live in the next district, like the neighbor district.
Yeah. This one is quite interesting also, how fashion is presented like art pieces. I think they are very good in placing them like that. Oh, now we're walking with red. Ooh. So here the Comme des Garçons store, a Japanese brand, Rei Kawakubo. Again, architecture, interior design, melting and fusing together with the actual product, like everywhere. Actually here, Daido Moriyama, Japanese photographer, who one of the artists collaborate then with fashion houses. So the fashion store, the interior architecture becomes part of course, the brand and also of the product. So it's one unique whole piece. Do you wear a comme des garçons? Do you have a comme des garçons? No. Yeah. So it's not a museum here. This is a fashion store. On the other side, what do we have here? Stella McCarthy. Stella McCarthy, and you knew Stella McCarthy, daughter of that famous Paul McCarthy. Also very, all the buildings here conceived to have the evening time in mind, because shops don't close at 6 o'clock, right? So you can now at 8 because of Corona, but you have the light is a very important part with all these buildings. So that they look, the architecture is actually underlined and enforced by the lighting here. And so now we are coming to the. You have been inside the building, yeah. Yeah. So this is the quite impressive, the Herzog de Marot Prada building with an extra underground entrance. And there's one, did you know, I mean, we know that the most luxurious thing to show in Japan is not necessarily an exquisite, expensive building, but just having the luxury of building nothing. So this space here alone, by keeping that space here empty, so there's only a wall covered with moss and a bench and an empty space belonging to the Prada building. That is how you show how luxurious you have the luxury to don't build anything on a plot of land in a city where there's no space, where you want to fill every niche with something because you don't have space to live. So that's how you. That's also a way to show luxury. And a luxurious way. And then again, next to it, an apartment building. I guess in Germany, that would be a regular apartment. No? Yeah. But here in Japan, it's very expensive, of course. This is so. Prada here, it's not allowed to, even outside, to photograph or film. They usually come, they're quite strict here in Japan with photographing and inside and outside. Also that I think is quite interesting here, this having a regular apartment building, and then you have the fashion store next door. So I think that's also one of the. There's not such a strict zoning you don't have here. No? You can have a family house and you have a factory and you have a fashion store all in one. That. So we have now nearly 8 o'clock here in Tokyo. Usually there's more, but of course Corona has slowed down a lot of things here too. Here's another view. Here you can see the electric lines. You know, the electric lines here in Tokyo everywhere above ground. So maybe, so you want to take over? Shall we? Or just let's walk over the street here. Yeah. Sandra, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Is it basically understandable?
Yes, I think it works very well. I had a few difficulties with the image at the beginning, but it looks really good now, I think.
Okay. So I would like to go to that, if we walk quickly down to the Kengokoma building. And again, so it's all very narrow streets here in Tokyo. And if you move the camera slowly because the image fades, So again, you have here apartment buildings, you have fashion stores. Those were originally, in former time, small two-story buildings and then mixed up. Here's one, a typical one from maybe this building is from the 1960s. Here too, you can see the windows. It's not a double insulated window as we know it in Germany. It is heavy windows. Very simple windows. It's ice cold in winter and gets wet easily. So then across the street, kind of a strange style apartment building, but this, I'm sure these apartments are about, if it's a small apartment, I'm sure it's about 200,000-300,000 yen.
Yeah.
About 2,000, 3,000 euros, small apartment, room, I'm sure more. From the outside, it doesn't look, for us Europeans, very spectacular. This is looks like a regular Sozialbau, but in a way, Also interesting is, so there is no focus on balcony. Balcony in Japan is not very important in a city. The balcony is there to dry your laundry, but not to sit there, have breakfast and look outside. So you don't have that. The balcony has a completely different function. Okay. So we continue. Well, you can also see that we are living in a very upgrade area by looking at the cars that are parked here. So most favorite brands in Japan, luxury cars are still Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen. Those are the big brands, car brands still. Yeah. So we walk down the small street. And in the city too, on bicycle, as we saw in Kyoto. In Kyoto more bicycle, it's much easier. The city of Kyoto is flat. The streets are all in a square pattern, so it's easy to find things and places. We're going now to this interesting wood structure by Kengokoma. It's actually a Taiwanese pineapple cake company. Here we have now 8 o'clock. I think the haircutters are open very late in Japan always. Now you see here a hair salon at 8 o'clock in Tokyo. And we continue further to the Kengokoma building, which is not lit, I think, anymore. But that is one thing what the Japanese are very good in. They don't scream out a product. They don't promote and market a product by screaming it loudly out, but to present it in a way that you, in the first place, in the beginning, you don't even see the product or you don't know what it is all about. And once you have recognized what it is, then it stays in your mind. I think that's the concept of marketing here. You So the building is not, maybe we can see, the building is not well lit anymore because it's late. Let's go from the other side. So it's a very weird structure of wood pieces. It's actually a giant pineapple, a pile of wood. I remember in my childhood, I don't know if it still exists, we had a place called Mikado. They are those sticks that you toss on the table, and then you have to pick out the sticks and be careful that the whole pile doesn't break down. It reminds me a little bit of Mikado. They still have that? Yeah. So that is the Taiwanese pineapple cake maker. It's called Sunny Hills. And their marketing concept is inside is a public space, a small tea shop. You can enjoy the architecture inside, and it's all free. You can drink tea there. You get the pineapple there. You don't have to pay, and it's very civilized. So I cannot imagine something functioning in Germany or in Austria, for instance, where you have a very luxurious, well-designed place where you can get everything free. You can sit inside as long as you want, and I think the culture is not there to respect that in a certain way too. But here you can see this intrinsic structure that is covering the building like a nest. It's like a beehive, nearly, by Kengo Kuma. He's one of the architects, the early architects who initiated a revival of wood. I mean, I mentioned before Kenzo Tange and Anlo in the post-war tradition, but I think Kengo Kuma paved the way for the tendency to show wood, to be proud of wood again, and much younger architects, younger than Kuma, like So Fujimoto, the Julian Worrall before mentioned, they built on that, they continued that. It would be interesting to see in which direction it will go in the future. Taking from there. So we post-war architecture first starting with concrete and then slowly going to wood again. Here from this side, it's also very nice to see this labyrinth of sticks, this Mikado building, I would really call it. So it's all covered. And then you have next to the building, like everywhere else, the vending machines. In winter also hot. It's quite, you can get addicted to this because when it's really hot, you use it as a hand warmer too. And actually I could drink one now, but I don't have some coins with me. Wait, so I guess we go back. Sandra, how do we look like time-wise?
Roland, I just wrote a message to our students that they can leave if they have to leave because we are over time. Okay. But I don't want to interrupt you because I do enjoy it very much. Okay, so they enjoy it. Students can leave now if they want because it's now over time. And we continue a little bit more. And in that direction, but basically we have finished our tour here too, and because we would go in the same way back now, and unless there are some questions, I can answer them now too, but basically we are going back now. Okay, Roland? Yeah, okay. Also, bist du noch da? Okay. Yeah, we are going back now, and basically we have covered that area now.
maybe a last view now. This in the back is the Mori, so-called Mori building. It's on top, on the, I think it's the 50th floor, I guess, is a big museum, the Mori Museum, and usually open till midnight. You can be on the platform, fantastic view over Tokyo, and basically from all the big buildings here, you can see Mount Fuji, Fujiyama. We are in the center of Tokyo, not the regular Japanese are not living here. This is, of course, partly residential areas, but those are people who have lived here forever and who had their houses here forever. But the general population, they take the subway home 1 or 2 hours and live in the suburbs. Okay. Sandra, I think we stop here.
Good.
And we are going back. Thank you very much. In case there are any questions, I can answer them now. Otherwise, we stop now here and we see then everybody again in December.
Are there any questions? No. There were some. For example, what was the name of the building? But they did answer it themselves, so there is not.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I have a lot of thank you here.
Great.
And thank you, Roland,
again in December. Mm-hmm.
for the excursion. Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay. Wonderful.
It was really a great day. Thank you also, Roland, to you and the guests. And looking forward to our next meeting in 1 month.
Yeah, and so Maiko also says bye-bye. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time, probably in Osaka. We will decide later. And excuse our technical experimentation here, but it seems to work, and next time we know it much better. Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.
Goodbye. Bye.